Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We are exploring Kindergarten Chats by Louis Sullivan. And this is, we're coming finale.
You're breaking up.
So, oh, I'm breaking up?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think I have some internet issues. But so if all of your co-hosts, if I drop off, just continue. I'll be joining in a few seconds, joining back in a few seconds. All right, so we are off. We're going to start with Sherri, Maritza, Joya, and Rupali. Sherri, floor is yours.
Okay. Hi, everybody. There's two parts that I wanted to talk about here today. One is going to take a step back into the prior chapter for a second, but that part really kind of flows into what Rob wants to talk about. So I'm going to handle that one second. The first part that I wanted to talk about was our new step here into Sullivan's idea of what organic means. And in our first chapter today on criticism, we get this wonderful description of a weed. And he talks here about how eloquently complete in expression, how rational and exquisite in structure, function, and form. With what consummate organization and unfolding has it arisen from its purpose, from the seed and the soil, expanding in sunshine, watered by rain and dew. And so I love the way we get this. We're going to get this even more in later chapters where he's talking more about architecture, and actually in some of the additional reading material, if everybody has the same version, there is at least one of the chapters we'll be reading for sure. The tall office building artistically considered. We start really getting what he means by this growth of architecture to come naturally from its purpose. And I just love that he talks here about the weed being and the thing of nature, and how we occasionally as humans are, if we don't, in a way he's saying if we don't fit in, we are like those weeds. But when we are eventually stay true to ourselves, then he puts in this reference here to this ugly duckling turning into the swan, which is lovely. But what here again, we get one of these, some of these phrases that Sullivan uses that just get you, like the empty soup can one. Here at the end of our chapter on criticism, he's talking about whether we are half men, and I'll get into a little bit more in a second here, but this phrase of being empty shells of human life. That's just a deeply profound piece to another little nugget of Sullivan's. But the important part that I really wanted to talk about was I wanted to take a step back to what we were talking about last week. And one, to correct something that I said. We were talking last week on several of these chapters, and especially when I spoke about this chapter on what is an architect, I used the phrase sense of life, which is, he's getting at that, but it's incorrect to be using that for Sullivan. That's really where Ayn Rand takes off and makes something fresh and new. And what Rob and I had been talking about this week was how much Sullivan has really created the fertile ground. He gets close to that idea of a sense of life, a philosophical sense of life. And when we talked, most of us here were in on the earlier group, previous book, talking about Ayn Rand's Romantic Manifesto, where we talk about, and I think one of the ways I described it was a sense of life is like the implicit and the explicit together, bound together. It's like having stereo speakers, the intellect and the emotion at the same time versus mono speaker. And when we read through Sullivan in these chapters, we're starting to see he's really toying with that idea. Doesn't quite get there the way she does, because as Rob will point out, once he gets really close to how to connect those two parts, it isn't fully successful. But in the meantime, let's take a look at how close he does get, which is pretty spectacular. So we're going to take a little step back into the very end of what is an architect, because it ties into a couple things in the chapter on criticism. So back here on my page 140, and Sullivan is talking about what an architect does. And he says, he must cause a building to grow naturally, logically, and poetically out of its condition. Notice here, poetically is important. We've talked about this before, that's the real crux of what good art and architecture is for him. And he continues, the real architect is a poet who uses not words, but building materials as his medium of expression. Remember here again, it's this issue of poet, the emotional side of it. He continues, he must impart to the passive materials a subjective or human quality, which shall make them live for other humans. So it's not just that the form and the function makes sense, but he wants that extra emotional element to it. And he continues on at the bottom of that page, to vitalize building materials, to animate them collectively with a thought, a state of feeling, to charge them with subjective significance and value.
And remember what he means by subjective.
Yes, and what we know what he is meaning by subjective is that emotional, spiritual side of things. So when we get on to the next chapter on criticism, there's a few other things here in the same line of thought. He talks about man being unbalanced, not having both sides. He talks about, and he's referring to his student in this line here, the germ of my constant purpose is to unify for you the outer and the inner life. Where's that other line? So he is getting very, very close to tying down that architecture, and not just architecture, but life itself, but living, needs to have both of those elements. Well, that's the weed part. And that in order for us to not have just functional buildings or just buildings tied to the value of money, which in our day that would refer to just buildings that are, gas stations. They can be something greater, but they often are not. They're often merely utilitarian. But that you really need to have that spiritual side as important as the rest of the functioning parts of the design, because that's what brings it to the level of art. Now he gets really, really close to tying these two elements together and getting to the idea of a sense of life and where it comes from and why it's as valuable as the intellect. And that's really where it ties into what Rob wants to talk about in the next chapter on knowledge and understanding. You want to take from here?
I'll take over from here.
Here.
All right. So, yeah,
where you got to scoot over here. Still only get half your head.
Where I see him building up towards a very similar concept to what Ayn Rand means by sense of life is the idea that you're vitalizing materials and animating with them. It says you animate them with a thought and a state of feeling. And that's very similar to what Ayn Rand was talking about with, a work of art is a material object that embodies a thought or a state of feeling. It embodies a view of the universe. And all that leads us up, and he talks about wanting to try to unify that. And now that brings up in the chapter on knowledge and understanding, which kind of ends up being a philosophical train wreck, unfortunately. Because that's where he gets down to the business of trying to sort of say how does basically intellect and emotion, how do they combine together? And he's not really able to do it. Because he starts in here talking about creating a difference between knowledge and understanding, where it says knowledge is of the intellect, understanding is of instinct. And let's see. And he complains that knowledge has that when knowledge comes along, when the intellect comes along, when man develops reason, that reason takes over from instinct, that it takes over from the emotions, and he says knowledge, so to speak, bullied understanding. And there's another phrase I'm looking for in here. Or is it, oh yeah, he talks about here began sin, the sin of intellect. So there's this idea that intellect and instinct or feeling have become, when intellect comes along, it takes over, it bullies the emotions and the emotional and instinctual aspect of life, and takes over, and you now have a conflict between the two. Now, I understand partly what he's talking about, the legitimate part of what he's talking. Oh, you already marked it for me.
Right there.
I understand a little bit about where he's coming from in this in a legitimate way, because I'm taking advantage here that Sherri has a bunch of old green highlighting in this, and she did an excellent job of highlighting.
Thank you.
Because every time I come through her, I'm like, oh wow, that's a really interesting point. So back here in the additional papers, and I haven't read all the additional papers. I was just flipping through and this struck me. But this is from an essay called "The Young Man in Architecture," and it's similar, very similar to Kindergarten Chats.
It's from 1900. It was
from
an address,
1900.
and yeah, it's important. It's right at the same time.
It's written about the same time, and it's very similar in that the idea is he's giving advice to a young architect coming up, and he says, "Should I begin putting into your hands a book or its equivalent, I would, according to my philosophy, be guilty of an intellectual crime." He says, "I say with emphasis, begin by observing." Now I'm excerpting things out. I'm just reading the parts that Sherri highlighted in green. I say with emphasis, begin by observing. Strive to form your own, seek to saturate your minds by direct personal contact with things that are natural, not sophisticated. Strive to form your own judgments, at first in very small things, gradually in larger and larger things. Do not lean upon the judgments of others. This is that. Then later on, when you begin to feel the flow and stimulation of mind, which are the first fruits of wholesome exercise of the faculties, you may begin to read the books. So I see what he's getting at with saying the intellect bullying everything else. Is what he means by it is the artificiality of books that are. He has a great line in here. Bear in mind that books, generally speaking, are composed mainly of sophistries, assumptions, borrowings, stealings, inadequate presentations, or positive perversions of the truth. The author too frequently is posing, masquerading, or ambuscading. His idea is to impress you. He himself well knows how little he has to say that can in strictest be classed as truth in his possession only. So he's basically saying that, you don't start with books, you don't start with what other people have said, with this knowledge that has been written down and memorized and given to you as formulas. You start by observation and direct observation of nature and forming your own impressions. So that part of it is good, but he ends up here with this idea of a contrast between intellect and instinct. And so he had talked about unifying them, or I think there's even the phrase the unitary ego is in here somewhere, but I can't find it. I'm sure you highlighted it somewhere. All right.
Sorry, open you on. It's up here.
Ah, there we go. Yeah. Oh, that's right before the sin of intellect. So he has something about the ego being unified, but he actually ends up coming up with a different formulation here. And he says, when we perchance momentarily cease our labors with the electron and the double stars, he's talking about, subatomic particles and astronomy, we may perhaps predicate the appearance of a new double star within the human firmament, the star of intellect and the star of instinct, each in its orbit, and each both responsive to their common center of gravity. When such star shall shine within man's soul, his becoming will increase and grow in splendor. All right, so he's basically coming up with sort of a dualism here. We're going to have the double star of intellect and instinct. So this is, instead of unifying reason and emotion, he's saying, well, no, we're not going to unify them. We're going to have as two separate things that are sort of kept in balance with one another. They have a common center of gravity that they react around. And I think it's interesting to look at the contrast between this and what Ayn Rand had to say about that, and what she had to say about emotion and the way of unifying intellect and emotion, which is very different. And I think where Sullivan goes wrong here is in viewing emotion as instinct and identifying it in those terms, because instinct is something that's sort of innate and pre-programmed. It has a non-rational, has some other source than observation and reasoning and intellect. So that's why you end up with this dualism that he has in this system. You have the double star. Is that instinct comes from something else. So emotion comes from something else. Intellect comes from something over here. Emotion comes from something else over there. They're two different sources, and so therefore you can't really unify them. You can just balance them. Whereas Ayn Rand, again, we're predicating this on the fact that I think most of the people who are here were here with us for the Romantic Manifesto. So you might recall some of what Ayn Rand said about sense of life there. And what she says about sense of life is somewhat different because she has a different view of the origin and meaning of the emotions. So she regards emotions as automatized responses to events that are based on automation of your previous thinking and observation and conclusions. So emotions don't come from a different source from the intellect. They come from observation and thinking and drawing conclusions, at least drawing them implicitly, even if you haven't explicitly identified them. So they come from the same mental processes, but mental processes that have been performed in the past, possibly when you were a child, mental processes that have perhaps not been explicitly identified. You might have implicitly drawn a conclusion without really naming it to yourself. And then mental processes that, instead of being held consciously and explicitly, have been automatized and held subconsciously. And so she doesn't view emotion and reason as two things coming from two different sources. She views them as the same thing being experienced or being held and experienced in different ways. And so the idea is that if you would then have a clash between reason and intellect and emotion, your job would be to stop and say, well, let's examine this emotional reaction I'm having, see what it's based on, what previous thinking went behind it. You do some introspection or psychotherapy if you need to, and you'd identify how did I get to that conclusion in the first place? How did I automatize this? Was it right or was it wrong? And then you would, if you decide that yes, this is wrong, this is clashing with what I know to be true, you would then work at, say, how can I de-automatize that and replace it with a more appropriate automatized reaction. And so that it very much affects her view of sense of life. There's no sense of intellect and emotion being contrasted in art for her. It's the idea that art ideally is bringing to you ideas and observations and thoughts about the world, the same subject matter as the intellect, but bringing it to you in a different form. And I like Sherri's analogy that it's, you're getting it in stereo. Mm-hmm. You're getting it intellectually, explicitly, and you're getting it emotionally and implicitly. Mm-hmm. So it's something that supplements the intellect rather than conflicting with it or balancing against it. But I think that, you know, where Sullivan differs, it's like he's going, I felt in the last couple chapters and the things Sherri was saying, that he's sort of like moving very much in the direction of the same concept that Ayn Rand has of sense of life. But then in this chapter, he goes off in a different direction and ends up with something kind of distinct from that, because of this premise he has of the emotional aspect of life being instinctual and not being non-intellectual and being contrasted to the intellect.
We were both commenting how much we think Ayn Rand has taken a lot of inspiration, a lot of, and I don't know if she was getting it directly from Louis Sullivan when she was researching for the Fountainhead, or if it was really more just part of the natural soil at the time. These ideas were talked about in a number of different locations, a number of different places. But we found that chapter really interesting in that it had it seemed very much like he's trying to form this concept of a sense of life. It hasn't quite yet gotten to the philosophical groundings of it, but it's so close, and you can see, well, because implicitly you would form these ideas first, and you would churn on them and chew on them for a while before they really get to that final kernel of an idea.
And I don't want to say too much about this because I'm be stealing Sherri's thunder for some future stuff. But the more I read this book, because I never read all of Kindergarten Chats before, but the more I read it, the more convinced I am that there's a reason why The Fountainhead was Ayn Rand's first really big novel, because there is so much of what she wanted to say about individualism and independence and independent thinking. So much of that is all right here, you know, in the foundations of modern architecture. And it was all recent, you know, you realize this is 1900. She was writing The Fountainhead in the 1930s. So it would be like me writing something based on stuff that had happened in
the 80s.
The 1980s or 1990. So, you know, it was all very recent in her time and very fresh and new. And, you know, and Sullivan really is just talking about, well, maybe we can have this new kind of architecture. And when Ayn Rand was writing The Fountainhead, that new architecture was there. It was coming out. It had gone beyond Sullivan. So it really makes me give an appreciation for why it is that The Fountainhead was, it almost had to be, you know, written about the subject and setting that it was, because so much of this idea of independent thinking and, you know, strive to form your own judgments and look at things through your own eyes, how much that was such a new, fresh thing in the field of architecture at the time she was writing it. By the way, we have taken.
I've already shown everybody.
We've loved it.
We now have a 2-part volume. But I don't think Joia agrees with you, Rob. No. Them's fighting words. Put up your dukes.
Yeah, I definitely have something to say about this, but I'll wait my turn.
Sure. All right. Next up, thank you, Rob. I also have some comments about it, so we'll go ahead and respond. Next up is going to be Maritza, Joia, and Rupali. Maritza.
So I have some comments as well. I actually understood this chapter on knowledge and understanding in a different perspective than I believe Rob did. So the second time I read these 5 chapters for today, I felt the need to read them in a different order. I don't know, for me, the idea of switching them to, I did knowledge and understanding, pessimism, citizenship, criticism, and then winter. I want to open with a question that's in the knowledge and understanding. Of what avail is knowledge without understanding? And then we're off, right? That's the first thing that makes you think. And I actually wrote like a whole bunch here, so I'm actually gonna do something I usually don't do, and I'm gonna read a script. I felt again that Sullivan had been peering into my mind in this, when I first started reading this chapter. Knowledge and understanding are not the same. This is something I've often postulated to anyone who listens to me. To know something is not the same as understanding that something. We live in a world where knowledge is ever increasing in its accessibility, and that leads us to the danger of equating knowledge with understanding. But it's important to note that while Google search knows almost everything, it understands nothing. What does this mean? It means that the mere accumulation of knowledge does not somehow magically impart also the associated understanding that must be attained. Sullivan equates understanding to a becoming and specifies the distinction between a becoming and a beginning. He says, there is all the difference in the world between beginning and becoming. One is almost mechanical in import, the other deeply spiritual. Sullivan continues, a similar difference exists between knowledge and understanding. My ostensible thesis has been architecture as a social function, as an art of expression. My real thesis, underlying that one and all others of all other men, is that within man, a spiritual being, resides a spiritual power capable of infinite unfolding, unnumbered beginnings, and expanded re-beginnings. Truth out of luminous truth. Infinite unfolding, unnumbered beginnings, and expanding re-beginnings. That's what he's saying equals a becoming, and as such, an understanding. He tells us that knowledge is of the head and understanding is of the heart. Knowledge is of the intellect, understanding is of the instinct. This brings to mind, for me, dancing. If you learned all the salsa dance steps in the cold environment of a classroom, when you dance, sure, it'll be beautiful. It'll be technically proficient. But unless you spend time hearing the music, understanding how each movement flows from a specific rhythm, you will never attain an understanding of salsa. One who learns salsa as a child in the kitchen while their mother dances as she cooks feels that salsa. They understand it instinctively. Understanding is of the heart. This is what I hear Sullivan saying to us when he says knowledge versus understanding. We can accumulate knowledge in this world, infinite amounts at our fingertips, right? But it's that process of breaking it apart and inspecting it and internalizing it that creates the understanding. Sullivan laments the chasm between knowledge and understanding and provides us with his idea of the key to the problem. He tells us that sympathy is the key, but not sympathy as a closed-minded view of the word sympathy. Sympathy as he envisions it encompasses intuition, inner sight, sixth sense, vision, and love. And this is Maritza's go run into a corner and cry for a little bit moment. Because wow, just wow, the concept of it is still mind-blowing for me. I have stuff written here, but I'm still going off on tangent. He tells us that it contains, encloses, and sets in motion and guides to a definitive goal, all that is human value. And that concept is like simply mind-blowing to me. The idea that the path towards a more symbiotic balance between knowledge and understanding is through a concept of sympathy that is all encompassing. That's just beautiful poetry to me. It really is. Another Sullivan quote is, when sympathy illuminates, there is light. When sympathy departs, comes the twilight. I find that to be something that could be a guiding principle for us in our culture, in our personal, individual lives. And that leads me, towards into the very few words I would say on pessimism, in that Sullivan tells us that pessimism is the winter which falls upon the mind when sympathy has flown. And I can see that. So if we continue to amass knowledge without taking the time to understand the important aspects of what we're accumulating, we fall into a despair, because if we don't have understanding of these items, it means nothing. It's like having one shoe. Like you have all these super expensive Louis Vuittons, but you only have the left one. It's not going to help you. And he tells, but then it's funny because he ends the chapter in pessimism on the most beautiful hopeful note. He says, pessimism could become the most passionate of protests. And it's like a call to us to say, it's not enough just to have this technical data. I'm gonna go deeper. I'm gonna figure out how to get to that other piece that'll make it more balanced within me. Sorry, my handwriting is deplorable here. and that moves us on towards citizenship. And this is my order, right? What speaks to me here is the individual cannot have two systems of ethics. And how does this tie in to pessimism, to knowledge and understanding? If we are only accumulating knowledge without synthesizing, we might be accumulating things that we don't actually believe. And if we find that to be unimportant, it's going to rear its head and probably beat you over the head with something sharp and unpleasant. It's the idea that as within, so without, is what I'm hearing him say to us here in this chapter on citizenship. I find that it ties beautifully to the chapter on knowledge and understanding, in that it's an admonition for personal responsibility and how it leads into social responsibility, in that it really is just irresponsible to have knowledge without understanding. In fact, he says there's I didn't actually write that one down. Let me see if I can, sorry guys, take a quick second to find it. Yes, he says, to possess knowledge without understanding is not only a misfortune, it is socially dangerous. And that's the tie for me with citizenship, that we need to find harmony and really balance, right? Balance is key for so many things. And he goes on to tell us that sympathy interprets man. And so I say to you, why not sympathy interprets mankind, right? So even if we use the closed-minded perspective of sympathy, if we project a little bit more of that onto our community, that's a path towards benefiting the community. Sullivan also admonishes us that some of us are born with different gifts, and where we may be viewed in like maybe superior in some ways to others, or maybe we can do something with greater ease than others. And he says that we have a responsibility to use those to benefit the community. I don't think there's enough people saying that the fulfillment of oneself lies in improving ourselves, because that in turn benefits the community. It bleeds out. And so that's, I'm gonna move on to criticism here, because I feel like this idea of having, being aware of your gifts and your responsibility to citizenship, it includes not thinking you're the best thing ever. And so, or not thinking that your time, your space, your community, your people are the best ever. We need a healthy dose of skepticism, internally and externally. And that's where I find that Sullivan's view on criticism comes in. He tells us it's vital and necessary. Because and what I'm hearing here is that it's important to remember that we should view different perspectives. Sherri brought up the idea he brings out, like, of the weed. And, he says it's impressive, but it's despised as useless. Something that he didn't mention here, and I'll mention to you, is that there exist weeds that are considered invasive and just totally deplorable, especially here in a city, right? Because they break up concrete and asphalt. Some of them are like powerful medicinal herbs. I don't know if anyone knows what plantain the weed is. It's actually a ragweed, so a lot of people are allergic to it. It totally looks like a weed that nobody wants, and it's in between grass all the time. So if you're trying to have that beautiful American flat grass, you hate it. But it makes the best all natural salve for psoriasis or eczema. And if you don't, you don't know that. You're just trampling it and you're putting Roundup on it because you want to kill it, right? But it's a powerful medicine. And all we have to do is change our perspective in order to see that. And I feel like that's very humbling, a thought. And acknowledging that one's perspective is not the only perspective leads us towards, again, this increased ability to slide on the scale towards understanding. Because I'm looking at it as though knowledge and understanding are on opposite ends of a spectrum, but it's a sliding, you kind of try to get a little bit closer. The goal is the middle, and you're ever increasingly going this way, and then something may happen that'll pull you this way or that way. And that's the way I view it. And I think that healthy amount of criticism and for perspective reshuffling is the path to get there. And when we're looking at criticism, I'm going to move, and then we finally get to winner, right? And the student is, he's so despairs. The student his hope is dimming, and he's like all kinds of dejected, and just the poor kid is lost. And my response to him and to anyone reading this and agreeing with him, I ask you to consider garlic. Garlic is an herb that has a very long gestational period in the ground, right? When you plant it in late fall. When winter comes, it has not yet produced any shoots, usually. If it did, they're very weak and feeble looking, and they look dead. So when frost comes, and also garlic takes up a large space, so you have this garden bed of garlic that just looks dead. It looks like there's nothing there. You've just got bare dirt, maybe old hay, and looking at it is very depressing. But to the unseen eye, it's been expanding and growing under the ground and building its roots. And now with the frost, it's just taking a nap. And the second that the last frost happens, it just wakes up and continues on its merry little path, and you start to get the shoots in spring. And from November to June, you pull garlic up in June, and you have like tons, and it's like this bounty, you get so much garlic, right? So that's what I say, is that if something looks dead and fallow and you despair, think that maybe it's like garlic and it's just resting. And in just a short amount of time, it's gonna be prolific and produce something super yummy for you. And I'm gonna read one thing from Winter and then I'm done. Sorry, I know I'm probably taking forever. So must I go on my way? So must I seek my way alone, if way there be? So my soul abide its winter time. So must the tiny hidden seed of hope await its day. For man is unto man alone. But I'm reading that just to say it's not true. It's just a waiting. And the best is still gonna pop up. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maritza. That was great. Next up, I particularly like garlic, the garlic story. That was wonderful. Next up is.
Let me just
Joia.
interrupt
Go
a
ahead.
special thank you for the garlic story, because we planted garlic for the first time in the fall. And every time we walk out in the garden, Rob complains, why did we do this? There's nothing here.
No, I'm actually, we have lots of shallots coming up, but I don't know when to harvest them. So I'll have to ask
Anyway.
Not till June. You gotta wait till June.
So
when the kid, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Maritza, finish your thought.
No, I was just gonna say, when the kids finish school, usually is the rule of thumb.
And you know, the garlic flowers are just as pretty. So if you just let it be, it'll flower, and the flowers are just as pretty to see. So it'll not only give you the garlic for the whole year, but you'll also get some flowers.
And suddenly our kindergarten chats group has turned into gardening. So appropriate.
That's Maritza's plan all along. Bring it all to trees.
All the trees.
Next up.
My turn. Well, I'm glad Maritza wants to bring this all to trees. I'm all for that. I even wanted to talk about trees today myself, and I do have some comments to make about what Rob said as well, and I even want to build on what Maritza was talking about in her discussion about sympathy, because to me that was the big important concept of this chapter too. But I first even just wanted to remind us where we are in the story. Everybody knows I'm the literature person. I love to follow the story here of Kindergarten Chats, and we are at another significant point in the story, because we're going to get now the third out of doors scene, the winter scene. And I even just wanted to read to you, this was again in all the supplementary material, when Sullivan, in his own words, describes what he's doing here, and how he's made a comparison, a metaphor with music, that we get like the melody and the counterpoint, it kind of goes up and down. There's a movement to it. And so we're reaching a really important part of the movement of this piece of music, or this story here. And as Sullivan describes where we are, the last out of door scene we had was the autumn glory scene. And he describes here, the lad does most of the talking and shows a certain lucidity and calm of mind. The discussion of responsibility, democracy, education, etc., has inevitably detached the lurking spirit of pessimism. It has to be. Into the depths and darkness we descend, and the work reaches the tragic climax in the third out-of-door scene, winter. So just to point out that that's where we've been, that, this was last week when we had right after the autumn glory moment, where we see that the student is going toward pessimism. And as Sullivan suggests here, that it has to be there's something in the current state of the world, which, as I think we've seen, was true then and is still true in the current state of education and perhaps architecture, that leads to a kind of pessimism. And now we're really going to get down to the depths of what that is. But as Maritza has pointed out, there is going to be a rebirth and a spring after this. So just to let us know that this is where we are in the story. And then I wanted to focus today on this chapter about on knowledge and understanding and about the drama of knowledge and understanding. So I just want to point out from my perspective that I love that this is Sullivan's perspective on describing to us how we're supposed to think about knowledge and understanding, to think about it as this grand human drama. And I think it is true that, again, we're seeing where Sullivan perhaps uses words in interesting ways or ways that aren't the normal ways that words are used. And we do have to pay attention to the way he uses words. And I think the important word to focus on here is the word sympathy and what that concept means to him, this idea of the power of sympathy. So one thing I want to say, even just drawing on what both Sherri and Rob said, is I agree too that I think it's wonderful to read this book along with Ayn Rand, because I think, as they've both pointed out, there are ways where these two writers and thinkers are very much in sync. But the way I see it is there's also ways that Ayn Rand has her own ideas and contributions and strengths. So certainly her theory of concepts and her concept of a sense of life, that very much is her, and something where I feel we can learn a lot from looking at Ayn Rand. And then I see that Sullivan has his own perspective, and that there's a lot that you can get from Sullivan. And for me, a huge part of what I get from Sullivan is this idea of powers, of man's powers. We're going to have the power of intellect, the power of instinct, and the power of sympathy, amongst many of the other powers. And what are all of these powers? And I think he presents this beautiful picture of what human life can be when you cultivate all of these powers, and when you cultivate them in a way that very much is like a gardener, and the way that Maritza was describing it to us. So I wanted to pick up here with what he describes here. So I think it's interesting even how we get into this description, and Maritza even read to us the line about how it is not sufficient to have knowledge alone. One must also have understanding. And the student here is even going to object for a moment. He says, is this to be a logic chopping expedition? Let us return to the poetic side. I understand it better. Close thinking tires me. I prefer to dream. We see the student doesn't even want to go into, okay, what really is the distinction between knowledge and understanding, and how we're going to reconcile them. He wants to have the poetry. He wants to have the dreams. But Sullivan has this great point. He says, I wish to broaden your dream, to expose something of the drama of the ages, the drama of man. Let us climb the summit somewhat higher. So I think this is even just a beautiful description of what it is that we're embarking to do here. How he's pointing out that it's not enough for the student to just sort of relax in the poetry that he might prefer, that there's a grandeur in this exercise of doing the close thinking of, okay, what do we mean by knowledge and understanding, and ultimately how we're going to put them all together. And seeing that in terms of this grand, sweeping human drama. So let's go into what this drama is. So he says, it is a strange, strange drama, a drama beginning with the dawn of civilization and extending even to this day, to this hour. It is true there has arisen a power called reason, but reason has failed thus far to effect a reconciliation, assuming that it has ever made the attempt or even recognized the disparity. For reason prides itself upon its coldness, its pulchritude. It calls itself pure. And intellect aspires to this self-same purity. It tends even toward abstraction. It is strange, a strange role in the strange drama that intellect, proclaimed by man his highest power, tends ever to forsake man. And man, following this motile star, falls in the ditch, climbs out, falls in again, and again climbs out and again pursues. For knowledge, man says, is power. He also says, after a fall, that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Now, is it to be supposed that if man were to extend his knowledge, he might arrive at a knowledge of understanding? I do not mean to say or infer or imply that man has not arrived at a fair understanding of some things, that he has not made some use of the vassal. His knowledge certainly is phenomenal insofar as it represents immense and patient labor and the stored up results. And I just want to fast forward to where he's going to even describe some of the things that knowledge has given us. He says, as man the inquirer He stood back of man the worker. With admirable ingenuity, he has extended his powers of observation, of analysis, of synthesis. With unceasing industry, he has formulated. He has given his findings with generous, overflowing hands to the world of active work. With equal abandon, he has given over his findings to those who create from the systems of thought, systems of procedure, systems of explanation, theories and hypotheses and speculations, whereby it is purposed to elucidate man and his universe. Man's intellect has examined all things piecemeal. It has examined man minutely in his body and in his mind. It has erected extraordinary systems in explanation of man's soul. It has produced vastly erudite accounts of man's career, historic and prehistoric, biological, sociological, emotional, and intellectual. It has erected its own conception of man in its own intellectual image. Therefore, it has utterly failed to understand man. It neither sought nor found him. What it sought and found was an abstract intellectual concept, a complete inversion of the reality. And then skipping ahead a little bit more, we're going to say, and yet it could be confidently stated a priori without this ramble, that intellect could not but fail in such a search. For such search, such recognition, such a claim lies in the specific province of instinct. It is through the primordial power of instinct alone that we may seek and find man. Intellect, having forsaken instinct, is at present unfitted for such fine work. That work must be done through the heart, for it is the heart alone that understands. It is the handmaiden of instinct, pulchritudinous and pure. When we perchance momentarily seize our labors with the electron and the double stars, we may perhaps predicate the appearance of a new double star within the human firmament, the star of intellect and the star of instinct, each in its orbit and each and both responsive to their common center of gravity. When such star shall shine within man's soul, his becoming will increase and glow in splendor. He will be prepared to know and welcome man. And so here I even want to just point out what I hear. So Rob kind of picked out this line about the double star and kind of suggests that there was this dualism, but I don't really take that in this reading at all. And it's going to get into where we're going next. But what I do see Sullivan saying here is that man does have these two different powers. There is the power of intellect, which we could think of as the power of reason. And we see that as a definite necessary power of man. And we see the ways that he even champions that power. And certainly it's necessary for the architect as an engineer and in all those ways. I think we see the glorification of the intellect side. And there is this other side of instinct. And I think the way Maritza described it was really beautiful, that instinct, it incorporates emotion on the one hand, because it is automatic. And we say even Ayn Rand had that idea that the emotions are what automatically comes from the subconscious. But what I even hear in the concept of instinct, and what I think Maritza even came up with with her example of when she talked about the child that understands salsa dancing from the emotion that they get from the instinct of the mother. There's something about instinct that's not just the fact that it's automatic, but that it comes in this primordial way. It ties back to that early childhood experience. I even see that this is sort of the connection with when Sullivan is trying to get the student to go back out into nature, that there's something about this that is so primordial about this emotional connection that we have to these first experiences with nature, with our mothers, that this is really what's there in instinct. And then I think what we're going to see now is that for a human being to be truly human, we need both of these powers. We need the intellect, and what I see here is the way he's even describing it, that intellect is sort of more the analytical capacity. It's what breaks things down into all of its different components. And then we're going to see, and that's the head, and then the heart and the instinct, because almost see it as like the heart and nature is more the integrative power, and that we need both of these. The double star is what has to guide man. So it's not even necessarily a dualism, but what humanity has is having the combination of these powers. And the significant way then I think is sort of how the powers do start to come together. And I wanted to talk a little bit, because we're going to get a little bit about I want to talk about the drama, and he goes on for a long ways about the drama, but I wanted to read just a little bit about some of the drama of how Sullivan sees that these powers kind of come into being and come together for a human being. So in this drama, we get here long, long ago in the dawn of proto-man, when the function man was seeking form and power within a hostile world, it sent forth out of the abysm of instinct, a sub-function which we now call intellect. This new appearing power sought form and activity that it might watch, ward, and direct, that it might assist in the self-preservation and self-assertion of the ego. That primordial power seeking form and assertion in the beginnings of man's becoming. As proto-man, in evolving, approached the form and contour of primitive man, intellect became more and more active, more and more dominant, while instinct as steadily declined in outward manifestation of power. Ego chose intellect for its counselor and guide through fear. And here began selfishness, here feudalism began its long career. And I want to just stop here to say that here, I think, we get one of these really important distinctions between Sullivan and Ayn Rand, because, Ayn Rand obviously champions the virtue of selfishness, and Sullivan here has a very different idea of selfishness. He sees selfishness as synonymous with feudalism, which is the thing where we want to overcome ultimately with democracy. So here we have this idea that there's something here that was lacking when we just have intellect, that if the ego chose intellect, it chose it through fear, and that there's something else that's missing. And it's ultimately going to be why we also need to combine the intellect with egoism, and that's what's really going to get us something that fully is thriving, which might be what Ayn Rand would call selfishness, but not the term that Sullivan would use. So I wanted to pick it up here. So instinct was not dead. Within him, it slumbered. Hence, man in his hunger sought with his intellect to create a companion. He became dual. He put forth an image of his loneliness, which took shape in dual philosophies, dual religions, dual civilizations, by way of compensation and balance. Thus, man, in becoming dual, lost his integrity. But unitary ego was not dead. Rather, it was in a trance. It slumbered and put forth intellectual wonders and aberrations, now and then dreaming greatly of its own integrity, as a holy dream within an all-enfolding illusion. Meanwhile, the heart yearned. It knew not for what. It yearned for surcease. It yearned for peace, for happiness. It yearned in silence for an understanding, while the intellect strutted, raved on in an ecstasy of ambition, and civilizations rose and civilizations fell. The intellect, with all its power, could find no stabilizing thought. Knowledge and understanding were far apart. The heart from time to time burst forth in storms of emotional protest, and ever again the intellect laid flat its chilling hand and gloried in itself. Meanwhile, man worked wonders. Self was his guiding star. He emitted glories. He exalted himself astoundingly. He drew Leviathan with a hook. He loosed the bands of Orion. Meanwhile, the multitudes dreamed that this was their dream come true. And I do want to, just skip ahead here because we go on, but just to point out here that even Sullivan is seeing that there was a real problem when there was this dualism, that humanity was yearning for the integrity, was yearning to bring all of this together. And it gets the students so worked up that finally, the student just says, tell me quick, how shall knowledge and understanding be reconciled? And here we get to Sullivan's answer. He says, there is but one agency, sympathy. And the student says, what? So weak a thing as sympathy? And Sullivan says, you mean so great a power as sympathy. Sympathy is that power, long dormant in man, which may harmonize all his thoughts, all his outward activities, which may integrate them, which may establish for them a valid center of gravity, an orbital self-impulse as our world moves through the infinite depths of space, carrying its precious human freightage. For sympathy is of spirit. It is at once the searcher, the visionary, the interpreter. And I even just want to stop on the idea of sympathy as the interpreter, because this is one of Sullivan's key concepts. If you remember when we had the chapter about what is an architect, Sullivan identified that the function of the architect was to interpret and to initiate. So this function of interpretation is so key to what it is to be an architect, and I would say what it is to be a thriving human. And now here we see that it is sympathy. Sympathy is that great power that allows us to be an interpreter. So more about what sympathy is. Its ethereal power underlies and enfolds both knowledge and understanding, were we but aware of it. It is man's greatest unused power. You may call it intuition, you may call it inner sight, you may call it vision, you may call it the sixth sense if you will, you may even call it love, if you but sufficiently expand and charge that word. What you call it matters not, for it contains, encloses, and sets in motion and guides to a definite goal all that is of human value, all of man's powers, and the output of those powers. Sympathy is the long-awaited modern Messiah. It is the essence and vital form of compassion. It tempers all things, it inspires all things when it comes forth as a suspiration from newfound man. Viewed from the summit of sympathy, the world to the clear eye of the prophet, the poet, the world of today changes its dull, forbidding aspect and becomes a revelation. So here we get sympathy. And then in our next chapter, we're going to move on to citizenship. And I want to share that in my reading this time, when I got to this next chapter, I had one of those moments where, I've read this book multiple times, and you get to this point when you read it and you realize like, oh, I think I've been missing something really important all along. So I've been stressing that I think the key to understanding Sullivan is to understand man's powers. And I absolutely do think that's true. But definitely in my previous readings of Sullivan, I've always focused on man's powers in terms of the individual. What are the powers that we cultivate as an individual? And I think Sullivan obviously has a lot to say about that, the powers of intellect and imagination, of understanding, of the powers of sympathy. But when I finally went from the last chapter to this chapter, to realize that something that Sullivan does say over and over again, and I just need to recognize how important it is, and I think it really is something profound that he's saying, that it's not just about man's powers as an individual, but man's powers when it comes together as society. And that is this important concept of democracy. And you may have perhaps noticed that he keeps coming back to his original idea of democracy over and over again. But it never struck me before just how important that is. How important when we're thinking about the powers of a human being and what an individual's powers are. That ultimately, we have to connect that with society, that it is the society of individuals coming together and their powers. And I even started thinking about this as a metaphor that I'm sure Maritza will appreciate. And I started thinking about, if we're starting with the idea of the seed and the regenerative seed, that the seed grows up into a grand tree. And that grand tree has lots of powers, and that is the individual. But ultimately, we need the forest, the way that all the trees come together. But that Sullivan's conception of democracy, it's a kind of super forest. Like this is where the analogy or the metaphor of the forest falls apart, because the human forest is this grand forest where each individual tree has the power through its works and what it interprets and initiates to then inspire growth amongst all the other trees. So it's an amazing kind of super forest is where I wanted to take that. And sympathy is, again, the key power to this, where he says here, if sympathy be the beneficent and fruitful quality of spirit, I hold it. His work must show that sympathy has illumined his path in illuminating his heart and hence his understanding, and that he has desired the good of all in seeking and finding an expression of aspiring democratic life. By this test, his citizenship must be tested. If, as I hold, democratic scholarship is of high usefulness and that it implies wealth of vision, knowledge, imagination, and sympathy, hence understandings, his works must so reflect such scholarships as to prove his fealty to understanding, to make evident and incontestable that his scholarship is used as a means toward attaining wholesome ends, that his scholarship has been applied for the good and the enlightenment of all the people. His works must prove, in short, and the burden of proof is on him, that he is a democratic citizen, not a lackey, a true exponent of democracy, not a tool of the most insidious form of anarchy. And I think we're going to see even more what this vision is, but it brings us to the line that I think here is important of this idea of democracy. And Sullivan says here, the remedy I have already indicated to you. It lies in that single standard of ethics implied in the idea of direct personal accountability here and now. It is for you to accept or reject that single standard. It is useless to quibble and say, if one man denatures the food he makes, why may not another man denature the architect he makes? It is fatuous to say the eminent denature thought and adulterate ideas, that we are a nation of adulterators, that we believe in makeshifts, that we temporize. The question is, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? That question, repeated with exclamation points in all capitals, that is the question I hear Sullivan asking all of us. What are you going to do? You as a human being have all of these powers. What are you going to do so that we can come together and create this grand super forest of humanity? That, I think, is the big question that is going to take us into the final couple weeks that we have here where we're really going to reach the climax. What are you going to do? But before that, we are going to have that little tragic low point here where we're going to see the pessimism, the poetry of for them. As Sullivan points out, a long, long night comes to some minds. For them, the soul of man is black. For them, humanity with all its hopes is but a Niagara of the night. For them, all tenderness is folly. For them, man is born in sin. For them, man may not prevail with destiny. For them, man is a futile thing. For them, for them, for them. But what about for you? What are you going to do? And as Maritza pointed out, we end here with winter. And, winter, as Sullivan says, has fallen upon our art. He says here, winter now falls upon my soul. There's a part in this chapter that makes me cry every time I read this when I think about the course of Louis Sullivan's own career. He says this is a prayer. Lord of this vast o'erhanging sky, Lord of the wintry heart, Lord of every somber tree and pallid snowflake, why hast thou let a winter fall upon my soul? Why are the seeds of my spirit dormant? Why are the fair flowers of my fancy moribund? Why are the well springs of my heart congealed? Why do they no longer ripple and murmur in sunshine and gladness? Have I not lived for my art, and art grown up in praise of thee? Must I then die for it? And dying leave not behind else a few precarious scattered seeds overlaid with the snow, when my heart was so filled with fertility? But the hope is that the seeds are scattered and the snow will melt and we will get that spring. And as the chapter ends, the student says, "You appall me, master." And Sullivan says, "Why should I appall?" He says, I should think you would despair after all this pessimism, after all the talk of winter. And Sullivan says, "Why despair?" And the student says, "Oh, in this mournful winter night and all it implies." And then Sullivan says, "And so I might, were not likewise implanted in my heart the belief in spring." And that is the belief that I think Sullivan is leaving us with and that we get to pick up with next time. Thank you.
Joia, that was wonderful. That was just wonderful. I particularly like your description of sympathy and the seeds of Louis Sullivan are growing right here now. So thank you. Next up is Rupali.
So I'm going to pick up from where Joia left, and I'm going to actually go backwards a little bit. So, he ends this chapter with the promise of optimism, and I did put in the chat a song from the musical Secret Garden called Wake. And it starts like this: when a thing is wake, it has a life about it. Maybe not a life like you and me, but somewhere there's a secret streak of green inside it. Now come and let me show you what I mean. And so in this secret garden, the gardener is telling this little boy, Colin, let me show you what life is. And he makes him dig and work in the garden, and he brings him out of the winter of his illness into spring of life. And so I think that with this hope and promise, even with all the difficulties that Louis Sullivan went through, he wrote this book when he was in those depths of his time in his career, where it wasn't as flourishing as it was before. And he did plant the seeds, and it's wick. There is wick. We are all, testimony to that. So yes, there are going to be ups and downs, and he talks about two kinds of people in his chapter on pessimism, that we have to be aware of all kinds of humans, that there are those who will exalt man and those who will despise man. And he goes about to describing what happens if we despise man and man's powers and do not act according to our powers. And when we are in that pessimistic stage, then there's no hope, there's no action. So going back to on criticism, he talks about the student has finally arrived. Education is done. The goal of education is to have the student be an independent thinker. And for being an independent thinker, the student has now taken this entire journey of investigating things on the external attributes, going a little deeper, studying the pathology of things, going further and looking at nature and looking at how nature relates to humans and human action. And now he's imploring the student to reflect and to think about, okay, what is my action? What are my values? What are the material, moral, spiritual values? And how are my actions going to impact the society that I live in? So on criticism, I think one of the things he says over here, he says, it's a question born of experience, retrospection and introspection. It is seldom asked by the young. Now, there's a difference between childhood and adulthood. And I think here is the difference that he tells us is now the adults can reflect on their actions. They can see what impact their actions have. And by developing that habit of reflecting, you can now investigate yourself. You can investigate your actions. You can investigate the actions of society on civilization. So he says, a man-child remains with nature and thus puts forth the utterance of his heart in one or another form: music, words, sculpture, philosophy, ethics, or other voice of that fathomless subconscious world which is nature's own. So he is now telling us, look at, we've talked about this with Maria Montessori's idea of the powers of man and Louis Sullivan's ideas of powers of man. And one of the things that I feel in the field of education, and Louis Sullivan is lamenting about it in the field of architecture, and I would say, let's look at all different fields and see how true that is. But we are so far removed from nature and being in nature that, we are developing certain deficiencies. I see that in students, there are sensory deficiencies or attention deficiencies. And it's very common in the traditional system to put a label and say, okay, this child has this learning disability. I feel there's a teaching disability. It's not a learning disability. And we are so focused on developing that intellectual academic aspect that we've forgotten that the child is an emotional being too. And we as humans are those emotional beings. And he talks about bringing, when he's talking about knowledge and understanding, when he's talking about intellect and instinct, he's bringing about those two in harmony. And he says, we need that intention, whether it is to build or to teach or to do anything. In each individual, we need to see who they are and the power that each human being has, each child has, without any judgment. And then all you do is watch the miracle unfold. So from the beginning, Louis Sullivan is encouraging the student to investigate. And from leading through that investigation, he's talked to the student about choice, about the power of thought, about the power of individual contribution to what makes society. So the student discovers imagination. He's learned to think independently. He's come to his own conclusions. He's not now regurgitating facts. He's actually now making his own observations and coming to conclusions. And now he has to take action. So now he's preparing for action in these chapters. So education is done, reflection is happening, and now we're preparing for action. And how will this action materialize or manifest? And it has to manifest with harmony, which is what he's talking about, bringing together all faculties of the human nature. And he says, once you are in harmony, you learn to reflect, introspect. Now, introspection has moved from the outward to the inward. It is discovering the man within each of us, identifying and reconciling with our own powers, our own instinct, our own understanding and knowledge, our own ego, our sympathy, and making us a whole man and not a half man. So he's talking about, bringing together, not working in, he also talks about private life and public life, right? That it has to be integrated. It has to be harmonized. You cannot have a separate set of values for your private life and then a separate set of values for your personal life. He says that standard is the same. And then I would say the chapter on citizenship by far has been very powerful. And here, I think, Joia, you did kind of highlight this in your talk about how it's wonderful to have all these individual attributes, but then how do you perform as a society? All these individuals are going to make society. So here he's talking about what is the function of the architect in society and how that works. He says, we must follow him to his function and place as a citizen. His citizenship must be outlined and defined as function of democracy, for democracy is our universal constant medium. So here he's talking about individual actions shaped by values, and he's talking about your values being of knowledge, of understanding, of imagination and reflection, of thought, values based on sympathy. And he then says that then you come to an action, and that action is good for the society. It then the work that the architect creates stands proof to what he is or she is. So he lays out a vision of an ideal democratic civilization. He says, if democratic culture be, as I hold it to be, the very flowering of heart and mind, the fine expression of personal and collective poise of heart and mind, of completed power of graceful natural self-government, the full index of spiritual democratic type because of the boldness and the breadth and the warmth of understanding, its nearness to all and its powers to comprehend and unify the aspirations of all. His work must show beyond cavil that his culture is true. By this test shall his citizenship be tested. And so he is imploring the student to really now think about what is he going to do. And I'm not going to repeat, although I'd marked the same paragraphs as Joia and Maritza, so I'm not going to repeat that, but let me talk about, what happens if we don't follow this. He says, per contra, there can be no surer test of spuriousness, the falsity, the narrowness, the venom of an alleged scholarship or an alleged culture than this. That is, holds itself aloof from the people, above them, exclusive, aristocratic, assuming that it is unintelligible by the people and meant only for a self-sufficient, withdrawn, supercilious class. Such scholarship, such culture is barren because of self-centered. It brings forth no fruit other than the shriveled fruit of popular ridicule, contempt, and distrust. So he's warning us against what happens when we don't focus on man's duty in the world and his part in the society. He says, let him pause to reflect that these powers are not truly speaking his alone, that he did not make these original powers, but that they make him by inspiring him to be conscious of them, and that they came to him out of the long birth and death struggles of people of all times who were born through the races in him, and that he is answerable to the people, to the world, for the prolific democratic use. It is precisely here that there must enter into the drama of democratic life the dominant roles of personal responsibility, personal accountability, and self-government. If the power-equipped man is to be a blessing to his time and not a curse. So I want to take this question, and then I want to share my screen and talk about Michelangelo's work. So, all right. Now, most of us are familiar with Michelangelo's works, and I just want to highlight a few of his works. Sullivan says, let me just find it. Oh, he says, but it has been a business to peer beneath the surface. In our progressing function as constructive critics, sympathy has so clarified our vision that we may see the man behind the screen of his acts, his institutions, his edifices, material and immaterial. And so here he is telling us to interpret the works of man using our own sympathy. And this is an exercise that we do at school with our students quite often. We just celebrated Mother's Day yesterday, and we went through images of mothers throughout history. And we looked at how humankind has viewed mothers in different parts of the world, in different parts of the cultures, in different cultures, and through art and sculpture, and we were able to come to an understanding. So here's an exercise for all of us to interpret Michelangelo as a man based on his actions. So here in this sculpture of San Spirito crucifix, he was an 18-year-old boy, and here you can see, the lifeless body with details in material that Michelangelo mastered. Now here is the mother and child, and you can see the child is just a little baby. And you can see the serene expression on the mother's face, on Madonna's face, right? And she is holding him with one hand. Any mother who has a little child will know that children are always about that age when they are able to walk, they are trying to run around. And they always keep them close by. And she is composed. She has her arms almost around the baby. And this is the joy of life. And now here is the Pieta, where it's the same mother and child, but the emotions are totally different. Here you can still see her face is veiled, but her face is at an angle. Clearly the emotion is that of sadness. She is holding the same child, but if you look at her other arm, there's one arm around the child and the other arm is just, the hand is just saying, I'm going to let go. It's the feeling of reconciling with death. And her face is veiled. There's a little dark shadow under her veil. So same artist, same material, same theme, but different emotions. And when we're talking about knowledge and understanding and sympathy, understanding of human nature, all of that comes together in these images. Here are Michelangelo's first forays into large sculptures. And there we have the God of Wine, and you can see it's a little tilted, and the dying slave, which was meant to be by Pope Julius's tomb. And you can again see the emotions that are captured in all of these statues. Here you can see the emotion of being a little tipsy, the emotion of dying, and both of those are reflected. Here is a beautiful, great detail of Moses with the tablet in his hand. Again, the skill that Michelangelo has, you can see it in all of the details, in the folds, in the fabric. All of this is just made with stone. And to have the skill and the ability to visualize and to imagine and bring forth in art that imagination is what Michelangelo is doing in his work. Here is the sculpture of the angel, and this represents youth. Again, we've seen humans represented through sculpture by the same artist in different stages of life. We've seen a child with its mischievous being. We've seen death. We've seen a little silliness. We've seen youth. And you can see in the sculpture, the angel holding, you can see the strength, and in the eyes, you can see the resolve that this statue holds. And then, although his most famous complaint was that he wasn't a painter, he was a sculptor. Here is his most famous painting of the Sistine Chapel. And all of these figures, I mean, there are almost 300 figures in this painting of the Last Judgment, but every figure is detailed with all of the contortions, or, you can look at all of those figures, and even though we can't see all the details, you can see the emotions in each of those figures. And then here is, I think everybody knows about this painting and God breathing life into Adam. And there is that tension where the fingers haven't touched yet, and he hasn't breathed that spirit into man. And when Louis Sullivan talks about having a poetic imagination, he's saying, leave something for the interpreter to interpret, leave something for the audience to think. So with that, I would end this and say, in winter, Louis Sullivan towards the end says, a sleigh passes in the dusk, a tinkle and it is gone, muffled up and quieted in the glowing night. So is man's little life, but a tinkle that is muffled quickly in eternal night. Now, what is that tinkle that we are going to leave in this world? I mean, this is clearly Michelangelo's sound was nowhere just a tinkle. He left a huge mark on mankind. And so what I want to say is, as a group that is looking at Michelangelo's work, what kind of attributes can we say Michelangelo had, and what can we say about the man behind the screen, behind the sculptures, behind the paintings? So this is an exercise we do with our students, and they come up with very fascinating words. I'm going to let you all think about what you want to say about Michelangelo. But some words that come during our conversations at school is a passionate person, skillful, detail-oriented, somebody who understands life and death, the life cycle of humans. So those are some things that come to mind as I'm thinking about what students say. So with that, I'll leave you with your imagination and your interpretation of Michelangelo. And you can look at many other works of other famous artists and interpret them in the same way.
Thank you, Rupali. Thank you. And that was great, bringing in Michelangelo. So what I want to do is I want to tell you about my understanding of the way in which Louis Sullivan thinks about human faculties. We've been studying Tao Te Ching, and Tao Te Ching has a very similar view. The core concept is that of nature. Core concept is that of nature, and saying that understanding how nature functions, that's a metaphysical issue. So that metaphysics is the aim, is what you're trying to grasp. And that is always there, present in his mind, that you're trying to grasp the metaphysical. You're trying to grasp nature. At the other extreme, there is the concept of who is doing the grasping. And there he has the concept of sympathy or spirit. This is even the curiosity of a child trying to take in that base curiosity. You can call it sympathy, you can call it spirit, you can call it will, you can call it attention. That ability to ask, that is what he's talking about when he's talking about heart. The core in you that is trying to grasp totality of nature. His complaints about intellect, and I will note that he is superb at use of intellect and reason. His complaint about the intellect is all about when people start to do differentiations which miss nature, which stop them from grasping nature. So he sees human being as a whole series of powers. For example, and the terminology that he uses is very different. And sometimes it is confused, and sometimes it is different from pages, books to books. The thing is that I've taken in all the books, so it's all mixed up in my head. So for example, in this giant book, Systems of Architectural Ornament, he has three groups of power: emotional powers, moral powers, and spiritual powers. All of them roughly translate into what we would call emotions. But he has this very detailed view of that. Now, when he's complaining about heart versus the mind, what he's saying is that the way you're reasoning, you are differentiating while losing the integration. And if you do that, you are not being a full man. That's what he's saying. That's his root of his complaint about the intellect. He also says that the other thing he's pointing to is the idea of subconscious and conscious, that you're conscious of some things, but you have to be always be aware what is there at the edge of your consciousness. And you have to incorporate that in as you go along. You cannot simply say that this is what is conscious to me, therefore that is nature. That's all there is to it. Classic example of that is Michelangelo. Michelangelo did not have words to capture the grandeur of Moses, David, Sistine Chapel. He did not have it. He had, again, Louis Sullivan has other powers in there. So for example, one of them is man is a worker, man is an artist. So he's producing that. And what he's saying is that he wants you to be true to nature and to yourself, and produce material things, produce ideas, have emotions, which are all consistent with the whole and whole of reality as such, nature as such, and the whole of you as a core of the being. And anything that doesn't comport with that or clashes with that, whether it is a product of intellect, or whether it's a product of emotions, or whether it is a power of your hands making things, he's against. So he's really pro-integration. So that's how I understand his powers and his criticisms. Now, he's doing this at a time where all the terminology has been completely screwed up by philosophy. So he has had to come up with, and completely screwed up by psychology. So he's kind of coming up with all of these things on his own, and different versions of it. You know, in Autobiography of Ideas, he has a different number. In some essays, he has different things for the here. But you can see what he's trying to do. He's trying to say, what is human being? What is our existence, including our individual, social, nature, transformation of nature, all of it put together. And how do we do this? What do we do? So that's what his approach is, as best as I understand it. All right, so I'm going to open it up for questions or comments. Anybody wants comments?
She can't.
Yep.
Can I go rogue here for a moment? I feel
Please.
there's a piece that nobody brought up that requires
You can go
addressing.
rogue anytime. Go ahead.
Just there's a very important piece in our knowledge and understanding that we didn't address, and I think it's super important. So when Sullivan is talking about his real thesis, you know, he says this grandiose thing: my real thesis underlying that one and all others of all other men is that within man, a spiritual being, resides a spiritual power capable of infinite unfolding, unnumbered beginnings, and expanded re-beginnings. Truth out of luminous truth. And that sounds fantastic. And I said it, and Joia said it, and I actually think somebody else said it. But the funny thing is, after he makes this statement, his student says to him, okay, I see that. I'm going to accept it as true because you say it's true. And I can almost see Sullivan like smacking the kid upside the back of his head saying, no, that's not right. So I think this next paragraph is so important. He says, you will accept nothing as true because I say it is true. Why fall again into the pit out of which I have dragged you, which is the worship of authority of dogma? If you say you accept provisionally as true what I say is true, well and good. If you see it as true, so much the better. And I think that just really needed, said for everyone. Never accept as true anything just because someone else tells you it's true.
Wonderful.
Integration, like Shrikant said. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Go ahead.
Shrikant, I'm just going to add to that the last paragraph from Citizenship. He says, go your way. And at times when the path seems too rough, too desolate and insurmountable, think not only of your architecture as your chosen art, but of the chosen expression of your citizenship. And I think this word think is the key there. Is you have the power in you to think. You don't need to take others' word for granted.
Wonderful. Folks, so now I'm opening up for questions. Questions, go ahead and type exclamation mark if you have questions, and panelists also will they can put their questions in as well. All right, so it's going to be Joia, Ash, and Joe. Joia.
I actually don't have a question. I just wanted to share something else to tie into what Rupali brought up, because she gave us all the wonderful images of Michelangelo. And in Autobiography of an Idea, there is a section where Louis Sullivan goes to the Sistine Chapel and talks about his experience of Michelangelo. And I just thought it would be great to share some of that, because it even ties into what we've been talking about today about instinct and intellect. And it's just so beautiful what he says. And especially because Rupali asked us to think about the words that we would use to describe our experience of Michelangelo. So I think it's even great to hear Louis Sullivan's words thinking about Michelangelo. So he says, the Sistine Chapel, one steady sweep of the eye. It was so easy, oh, so easy, so self-evident. Thus accumulating agony ended forever in a supreme moment of relief. And Louis knew once and for all that he could see anything that I could see. He would not have used the word momentum, an academic word. He would have called it the work of a man powerful, even in old age. Louis spent 3 days in Rome, 2 of them in the Sistine, alone there almost all the time. Here he communed in the silence with a Superman. Here he felt and saw a great free spirit. Here he was filled with the awe that stills. Here he came face to face with his first great adventurer, the first mighty man of courage, the first man with a great voice, the first whose speech was elemental, the first whose will would not be denied, the first to cry yea in thunder tones, the first mighty craftsman, the man of superpower, the glorified man of whom he had dreamed in his childhood, of whom he prophesied in his childhood as he watched his big, strong men build stone walls, hew down trees, drive huge horses, his mighty men, his heroes, his demigods. And just skipping ahead a little bit, here was power as he had seen it in the mountains. Here was power as he had seen it in the prairies, in the open sky, in the great lake stretching like a floor toward the horizon. Here was the power of the forest primeval. Here was the power of the open, of the free spirit of man striding abroad in the open. Here was the living presence of a man who had done things in the beneficence of power. And Louis gazed long and long as one enthralled, and with his own eyes, with his own responses, he discerned more and more. There seemed to come forth from this great work a mystery. He began to see into it and to discern the workings of a soul within. From beneath the surface significance, there emerged that which is timeless, that which is deathless, that which is its immensity of duration, its fecundity, its ever-present urge we call life. And in this great outpouring which encompassed him, he saw the dreamer at his work. For no hand unaided could do this. No intellect unaided could do this. Imagination alone could do this. And imagination looked into, revealed itself as uncompromising faith in life, as faith in man, and a special faith in his wondrous powers. He saw that imagination passes beyond reason and is a consummated act of instinct, the primal power of life at work.
Wow, Joia, that's an amazing book. What book is that? We should look at it. We should study it.
Yes, we all should look at this book. Next.
Next up is Ash, Joe, and Chris. Ash. Ash, you're on mute. Ash, you're on mute. Just a second. I don't know. Okay, let me see. There is a problem. Give me a second. Give me a second. My fault. Sorry about that. Go ahead. Go ahead now.
Okay, now can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. So I'm still trying to understand this distinction or relationship between knowledge and understanding that Maritza talked about, and it's kind of run through the discussion here. So is it that understanding is a sort of higher order organization of our knowledge that connects it to our values, and that's how it brings about this harmony between reason and emotion that Sherri talked about? Or can anybody elaborate more on that, or have any other clarification to add?
Okay. Yes, Maritza.
I think it can be viewed that way. I'm going to use Shikant's word. It's my new favorite one for today, integration. I find that, or at least it's my belief, that understanding is the integration of that knowledge that you've accumulated and making it your own.
Yeah, I think what he's saying is that to him, understanding means it's a metaphysical. You're saying you're trying to understand the totality of how do you need to function in this situation. So it's a totality, it's a full integration. Knowledge he's referring to when there is a piece of information that you have, but that is not necessarily integrated with everything else. So it's kind of differentiated knowledge versus integrated understanding of you, who you are, what the world is, what you need to do, and how you do it. That's what he would call understanding. Is that clear?
Yeah, that's helpful.
Okay, thank you. Next up is Joe and Chris. Joe.
Wait,
I think Sherri and Rob wanted to say
Oh,
something.
sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add something. So I also think when he's talking about knowledge versus understanding, he is talking about bringing in the emotional aspect of things. So I'm going to sort of take a more pro-Sullivan approach on that. There is an aspect there that I think he is correct about, and I think specifically from the perspective of the creative artist, that a creative artist can't just understand things from the top down. It needs to come from within out. And I really liked Maritza's discussion about salsa dancing.
Yeah.
Which actually makes me want to go salsa dancing. But the idea that, it can't, you have it instructed to you, the details of it, but then you also have to do it enough, or have enough experience with it, or, grow up with it, or in the kitchen when you're a kid, and have it be able to feel the music and feel the rhythm in that subconscious way. So, and I think that, you can get a lot of artificiality in art when you have somebody coming and saying, okay, I've got this thing I want to do from the top down, and not have it be something that's coming from the inside out. So I think that's part of what he's trying to capture. Like, I have quibbles with how he does it philosophically, but I think that's part of what he's trying to capture with the differentiation of knowledge versus understanding.
Excellent point. Next up is Joe.
Yeah, I have something like a little bit similar in the sense that, is this like a dialectical method? Is that a good way of thinking about it, in the sense of that you have, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and you start to think about knowledge, understanding, and sympathy is kind of this kind of way of kind of integrating all of these thoughts together. And I start to see a little bit of, maybe I'm just trying to wordsmith here too, is like the distinctions between empathy and sympathy too, because there's an emotional component to empathy that exists that, and I kind of see that in this framework per se. But is that a good way of thinking about maybe how Sullivan is attacking this problem? It's like more of a dialectic between all these.
I don't think so. I mean, I think
Okay.
that Hegel's way of approaching it is very different. Sullivan, it's very, very different, because it's like he doesn't see it as being a conflict. He sees it, what Sullivan is trying to do is to do integration, and he notices it when there is no integration. So as Rob was saying, so for him, integration means integration of all the faculties. So it's not only that you should be feeling the certain way, you should be building the certain way, you should be acting a certain way, you should be dealing with other people in a certain way, you should be feeling from the core of your being in a certain way, you have to be effective in the world in a certain way. And when all of that is lined up, that's the integration. And that's how he thinks. And he thinks that that's what human beings have to do. That is human to him. That is fully human.
Okay.
So it is a far more profoundly integrated way of thinking than the Hegelian approach. Okay. Next up is Chris. Folks, if you have questions, go ahead and type ! Chris.
Yeah, sure. To pick up on the prior two questions, I guess we're all having, there's a theme today, which is mine's just more fundamental of what we mean by sympathy here. It seems, just given that Sullivan used terms differently than how we understand them today. And then even I think amongst the presenters, there was a little bit of disagreement as to what the concept really meant. I didn't feel like the way he describes it in the passage necessarily elucidates the distinction versus, say, understanding here. So I'm just wondering, is he just using a different word to describe kind of the same notion of integration here and just different aspects of it? Or do people see this as kind of a distinctly different kind of faculty, if you will? And if so, what is that? And how is it distinguished from a kind of knowledge, understanding, and integration, or reason and plus emotion?
Fantastic question, Chris. Rob and Sherri.
I want to start on just one thing, which is talking about that we do have this issue of the 19th century words, right? That don't always mean the same thing. That languages evolve, they get used different ways today. And I think one of those is sympathy. Because sympathy today is used primarily just to mean something more like empathy. It means fellow feeling with another human being. Like, oh, I really sympathize with this thing went wrong in your life. I really sympathize. Whereas sympathy, it means to feel with or to feel together. And sympathy had a wider and oftentimes more vague meaning in the 19th century, which often had an internal psychological thing. What was one of the Sherri's looking up the dictionary here.
It always helps when you're reading Sullivan, I think, to look up the words and don't even read the first one or two lines, because that's the modern version.
Don't read the first definition, read the third and fourth.
And don't go all the way to the bottom, because that's 100 years before Sullivan, but going to go right in the middle. And you often find a better idea. Like, for example, here they're saying sympathy is more about unity or harmony in action. So that's where he's getting that connection.
Yeah, the quote here is every part is in complete sympathy with the scheme as a whole.
Yeah.
And so I think that's more what he means by this faculty of sympathy. It means it's like this, he has to, I think it's because he has this sort of, I argue that he has this sort of dualism of intellect and instinct, that he then has to create another, we have another power, another faculty
that connects
that
them.
is the integrating faculty that sort of brings these things, makes them work together. Sympathy is.
I have something to add here too. Oh, sorry.
So, Robert, you're saying it's almost kind of like a metaphysical form of integration?
Or a psychological form of integration. It's human faculty that integrates these, that takes and balances and integrates these other things. The word sympathy literally comes from, my expertise is partly the Greek roots of things. So, it means to basically to feel together. Pathos is feeling, and sim means together or with. So it can mean feeling together with another person. That's the way we generally use it today. But it can also mean your own feelings, all of the things going on. Pathos actually means feeling or experience, right? It can even mean suffering. That's where you get pathetic. So it can mean basically any internal experience. And the older, sort of more introspective form of sympathy is the idea of integrating all of your feelings together, all the different aspects of your consciousness being pulled together to work together. I think that's more what he's using it here.
Next up is
wait, I have something I want to say here.
Go ahead.
So do I.
Sorry, because I just want to add to. I want to totally agree with Sherri and Rob. Looking at the dictionary and figuring out what it meant then, and I thought it was even interesting because Joe brought up the concept of empathy, and I think sympathy was definitely the term that was used much more in the 19th century, where you never really heard the word empathy as much as you heard the word sympathy. But I want to argue that I think for Sullivan, you have to kind of go beyond the dictionary to what Sullivan says, especially for words like sympathy, where he has, I think, his own unique concept of what this is. And admittedly, it is difficult. And I would say this is one aspect where perhaps maybe sometimes I appreciate Ayn Rand more, because she was very more specific about her concepts and being very explicit about definitions and insisting on definitions and what is the definition and what does the word mean, where Sullivan more often will give you more of a poetic description of a term. I think especially for words like sympathy, where he's trying to capture something where there really isn't a good word in English. And he really is, in a very unique, innovative way, trying to put his finger on something and trying to come up with the words. So I just even wanted to come back to way back. We had the chapter on attention. And here we had, just to draw our attention back to this, just another one of these great descriptions of what sympathy is all about and how sympathy is this word he's using to try to put his finger on grasping totality. So what he said here at the end of the attention chapter was, he says to the student, but when you accumulate abundantly, absorb totalities, not fragments, grasp the largeness of things, not the petty isolated aspects, lay hold upon the warm significance of realities, not the mere cold currency passing from hand to hand, seize upon the drift, the color, the intensity, the what you may call it, of the moving, teeming life about you, not merely upon its broken facets of definition, and follow every path, every trail that leads toward emotional and spiritual riches, paths hidden alike to the heedless and the oversure. And then when you give of your abundance, and this it is to live. If you receive not, you cannot give. And to receive of life, you must be awake to it. Shut the heart and you close the open door of sympathy upon yourself. And in the doing, exclude the light of the world. It is sympathy that leads, sympathy that draws us on with an invisible hand, beckoning, persuading, illuminating all things with her smile. She knows the heart's desire. She divines a simple longing, for she is that longing, going ever outward to the doors of sense, and she seeks until she finds her mate. Then together they return to you and enter, and ye three are one. Of such is sympathy, the liveliest tenant of the heart. So what I call attention becomes what you call interest. So what you call an impression becomes what I call an answer. So living becomes action. Seeing and listening, functions of life, and all by virtue of the gentle force we call sympathy. Sympathy, the receiver, the giver. Sympathy, I, you, the poet. So you see here that, he really is trying to grasp at this new idea of, I think what we were saying before, of integration, of trying to get at the totalities of everything, both the intellect and the emotion. And he's using sympathy as that word for the power that comes from the heart and allows us to pursue life and nature in all its abundance and totality.
Maritza.
I just want to throw up really quickly here is that just a reminder that he does also tell us that it doesn't matter which word you use. He explains that he's using sympathy, but it's the essence of the word that he wants us to remember.
Excellent. And I think you basically have to read all the books. You have to read Autobiography, Kindergarten Chats. You have to read System of Architectural Ornament. You have to read, you have to read Democracy, A Man's Search. Then you have to see all his buildings and then get it. Now, if you think this is hard, no, this is easy. We are looking at Tao Te Ching. Okay, Tao Te Ching is written a lot earlier than 19th century. It's 500 and it is written in a different culture, Chinese, and it is written with a different script. It's only 5,000 characters. And what I'm finding is that what people are calling translations are actually interpretations. So you have to look at all the interpretations and try to figure out what is it that is being said. Okay, so sympathy is easy, relatively. It is basically a human being reacting to nature from the core of their being, that ability to respond to and to take in nature from the core of your being. That's what he's referring to. And he
to take in and to put back out, though, both.
That's the start point. The core point, his point is that if you can't take in, you can't put out. It's once you can take in, then it's just it kind of follows from it. So sympathy is focused on that. Just trying to make it easy. Next, okay. Are there any more questions if the panelists can have questions or comments, or anybody else. All right. Okay, folks, this is wonderful. This is just wonderful. And we are looking forward to, now we are getting really into the greatest of the chapter. Okay. We are going to look at 3 chapters. That is, what is it? Poetry, on poetry, art of expression, and creative impulse. Those 3 are really what the entire book is about. Everything is building up to it. And the last one is just a celebration of it. Okay, the one that the last 2 chapters. So don't worry about them. If you can get these 3 chapters, you got everything. You get everything. All right. So that's what we're going to do next time. So see you folks then. Bye.
Bye.
See you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.